Is this thing on yet?
Reminding the gentle readers, the preceding sections are in part meant to reply and clarify the legit concern that the terms fact, truth, falseness, etc. are being misrepresented or poorly used in this piece. It is hoped that the preceding section is a sufficient sort of reply and clarification as to what is intended by the use of those terms. It is also hoped that by providing such clarifications that the situation regarding the central inquiry is itself clearer. Factual analysis simply cannot be sufficient for the dismissal of Flattish eartherism. Not on technical grounds, not on factual grounds, nor on ethical grounds. If factual analysis isn't really sufficient for the dismissal of Flattish eartherism, then there must be some other mechanism whereby dismissals of concepts, ideas, etc. occurs. This doesn't suggest that there is necessarily an ethical basis for doing so, but does suggest that there is at least pragmatically a mechanism whereby the species does this, because after all the species does in point of fact do this sort of thing. Without, making some kind of deontological argumentation for it, folks likely agree that a methodology that has tended to be used is truth, and truthiness. With a bit of historical wisdom attached to it, we may also note that the history of colonialism and the methodologies of colonialism also inform us as to the methodologies whereby this sort of dismissal of concepts, ideas, etc. has occurred. Hence, the premise of this piece, The Odd Questions of Privilege, A Slight History of Colonialism. Before moving on, I think it worthwhile to really hammer home the issues involved with factual analysis as it relates to these questions. Factual analysis is very much a kind of taxonomy, a classification of things and stuffy stuffs. We may include within factual analysis the plausibly additive factor of mechanical causal sorts of relations, the various methodologies, in other words, whereby the factually classified things and stuffy stuffs may interact with each other towards this or that end or aim. However, ultimately none of this actually dismisses any aspects thereof. For instance, we may note that some methodology of interactions between thus and such a set of things and stuffs produces this or that sort of result and not some other sort of result. However, that doesn't actually dismiss the ontological states of any of the participating aspects. At most, and at least, and at best, such may inform as to what is pragmatically functional towards this or that end or aim. See also the discussion of teleological justifications a bit later in this piece. To hold that X and Y produces C results, where and B does not produce C results, may be sufficient to dismiss the claim that and B produce C results, pragmatically speaking. Note, however, that by doing so we are actively choosing to do so. There is no inherent mechanism within that whereby the claim and B produce C is actually dismissed. Indeed, the claim and the idea can be made repeatedly thereafter. Likewise, whatever actions may be associated with the and B may continue regardless of their factuality or lack thereof in producing Z. It may not actually, factually produce C, and nevertheless the claim persists. Moreover, the pragmatics is doing a lot of the labor here. It may be pragmatically the case that if the productive result C is the aim, then it follows that one ought not do and B, but rather one ought to do X and Y. But these are highly contingent sorts of things. It may be the case that and B produce some verisimilitude of Z that is good enough, or that there are costs of X and Y that are undesirable, or that C is not actually the sort of thing anyone was aiming for in the first place, or that and B produce other sorts of desirable things aside from Z. This may seem like a bit of dodging, but I think not, as we are speaking here of pragmatics, not deontological things in and of themselves. Those sorts of contingent factors become rather heavily important. Likewise, there is an unspoken odd or ethical claim being made that is taken for granted and without any sort of consideration. the sorts of considerations being exactly the kinds of things raised in response, and indeed, the sorts of ethical concerns being raised in this piece. For instance, there may be consequences to TPKing flattish eartherism that are undesirable, or there may be consequences for accepting mathematical precision as a meaningful ethical concern that are undesirable. What is C after all? What are A and B and X and Y? Is flattish eartherism a good enough sort of verisimilitude of the truth such that we ought not bother worrying about it at all? As previously noted, it is highly likely that the species' brain structure develops within the constraints of flattish eartherism, entailing on a pragmatic level that it is in fact a good enough sort of solution. It solves the pragmatic problems of the species' ontological state, e.g. existing within a gravity well, in a manner that enables the species to not merely survive, but thrive. It is a simpler sort of solution, but then, its simplicity may very well be understood as a boon, in that it doesn't constrain the claimant as much. The roundish earther has far stricter rules of understanding than the flattish earther. False premises permitting anything to follow while true premises restrict that which can follow. The point, no amount of factual analysis actually effectively dismisses flattish eartherism, and moreover, more to the point of this piece, factual analysis doesn't actually provide any sort of meaningful ethical basis for the TPKing of flattish eartherism, which is likely disappointing to a lot of people. With the preceding in mind, I want to suggest a plausible modality of ethical thought on the issue as it relates to the pragmatics and ethicity of TPKing these sorts of things in general. Some key points to highlight. 1. These kinds of things are perennial. They arise forth within the epistemically ontologically valid conceptualization as a matter of course. 1a. Hence, the TPKing of them may have very little ethical concern one way or another. We might even hold that such is a part of their iterative functional relation of life. 2. These kinds of things may, and very likely do, have some base neurological functional relation to the conceptual operati they are presenting. In other words, there is likely a foundational brain structure that informs the various dispositions. 3. Rather than thinking of these kinds of things as merely concepts, though concepts they are, we ought to be thinking of these kinds of things as coextensive with what the species typically refers to as themselves, their spirits, their soul, the who and what of the species. From these, we may derive the following. 4. The TPKing of flattish eartherism is ethically permissible, in virtue of the fact that it is unsuccessful. We may appreciate the trying, the effort, as its own sort of thing, but ultimately there is no full-on success to be had in TPKing such a thing. 5. The TPKing of flattish eartherism may be ethically praiseworthy, though not ethically obligatory. Meaning that it is a praiseworthy kind of thing for someone to do, based on the mereness of the factual correctness of the ontology sans any epistemically relevant criteria at all. We may hold such as little more than adding to their ontology, for, after all, the attempt will be unsuccessful anyways. It is not obligatory as there is no ethicity to the TPKing of such things at all, in the same way that we may hold there is no efficacy in attempts to move water with a holy bucket, pun intended. 5a. Such introduces the notion of creativeness, creation, etc., of these kinds of entities as an ethically praiseworthy sort of activity, which we shall examine as it relates to other more controversial and more commonplace aspects of colonialism. 5b. What we mean by adds to the ontology in this case at any rate, is that it adds the notion of roundish earthness to the ontology without actually destroying the flattish eartherness ontology. Being additive, rather than merely destructive, is what marks it as ethically praiseworthy, while also not being ethically obligatory. 5c. Significantly, it lacks ethical obligatoriness due to the failure of flattish earthism to be harmful, and because the flattish eartherism is very likely a perennial sort of thing. 6. In practice, such amounts to education in the following rather specific sense, teaching what flattish eartherism is, why it is what it is, and that it is despite its factual failings. This particular argument is dependent upon the premise that flattish eartherism is the sort of thing that cannot actually be TPK'd. The impotence of the TPKing grants ethicity to the act. The argument holds the additional justification that additions to the existing ontology have ethical virtue to them as such. The supposition more broadly is that there are a host of such entities that constitute much of the relevant conversation of the species. For instance, racism, sexism, nationalism, etc., likely have of themselves a kind of perennial aspect predicated upon base neurological structures of one kind or another. We could go so far as to name them fear, hatred, jealousy, and nominal differentiating. The latter, nominal differentiating, ought be understood as the practice to differentiate the ontology along arbitrary grounds via an assumed self-sameness predicating structure. In technical parlance, the identity relation A equals A, the differentiating of the self as such, the self per se, the cult of the self, the methodologies whereby the species assumes the self-sameness of an identity of any given subject or object, especially as predicated upon the nominal formal features as presented. For instance, differentiations predicated upon skin color are differentiations predicated upon a nominal formal feature. Likewise with differentiations predicated upon the bodily sexual form, and so forth. All such things we may very well hold follow the form of the flattish earthers, e.g. they are perennial conceptual structures that form as a matter of course for the species. They are factually incorrect. Indeed, they are oft logically inconsistent, though they are predicated upon factually correct aspects, e.g. there are factual differences. It's the interpretations of those differences as being meaningful in such and thus a way that are factually incorrect. We likewise may hold that these can be described rather broadly and categorically as biological errors. That is, that the root of the issues with these kinds of things are exactly within the biological structures of the species. Folks ought also apply the notions of aesthetic ethical praise/blameworthiness to these kinds of things. That is, that what the species is generally doing with these is playing within the ethical praise/blameworthiness of aesthetical concerns, which on its own may actually be fine. Indeed, it may even be praiseworthy after all. Among the most serious of issues, as previously alluded to, is to categorically mistake these kinds of ethical praise/blameworthiness kinds of things for ethically obligatory sorts of concerns. I would again point to the humorous point given by Key and Peele in the skit Ultimate Fighting Goes to the Next Level, or the previously alluded to example of a dancing couple being legally condemned for showing hair in a dance in a public space. Having tastes, aesthetical considerations, giving praise or blame to them predicated upon such things, may actually be a fine kind of thing to do. A sort of actual play fighting of the spirits, whereas to misapprehend such as being that towards which ethical obligatoriness accrues leads to the kinds of absolute horrors associated with wars, genocides, and especially colonialism. Hence a kind of second key aspect to colonialism. Firstly, there is the scientism that is under strict scrutiny here, whereby the justification given is that some action isn't real, whereby that term has rather specific connotations to it, and those connotations entail a further ethical sort of claim that holds, because it isn't real it ought not exist. Secondly, there is the misapprehension of ethical aesthetic kinds of concerns which adhere to praise/blameworthiness, for ethical concerns that adhere to obligatoriness of actions. Really though, the former is but a species of the latter, one that hides itself rather well in a cloak of being the real, when ultimately it is just another peculiar sort of aesthetical consideration. One concerned with simplicity of form to the point of an almost maniacal need to cleanse complexity in the name of the real. The quip, nature abhors complexity, is a rather strikingly odd kind of disposition, given the magnitude whereby that view finds itself pitted against such a host of complexity that it must somehow make sense of. Likewise, the degree whereby complexity is fairly easily seen in nature. Taken together, these, again, we might hold such as biological errors of the species. the gross misapprehension of reality whereby the concerns of something like aesthetics are taken to be concerns about ethical obligatoriness. I am reminded of the picture of a monkey holding a banana to its head, as if the banana were a gun. The destruction, that is, of the biological errors as being an action of kindness. As with Flattish eartherism, we may also hold that such is exactly the sort of things that constitute the human species, at least to some extent. In the same way as we may have serious ethical concerns regarding the TPKing of Flattish earthers, especially concerns as they relate to colonialism, we may have those kinds of concerns regarding far more controversial aspects of humans, such as racism, sexism, etc. These points deserve a great deal more explanation and examination to them, but the crux of the matter is that they very likely are exactly the sorts of things whereby what the species generally refers to as cultures are derived from. To TPK differentiations predicated upon the nominal differentiations is very likely to TPK cultural expression as such. Or, at any rate, that is the very serious concern to be raised here. A total cultural genocide accrued through a practice of cultural genocide upon these kinds of biological errors. Folks ought not mistake the casualness of that statement as indicative of its ethicity, one way or another, nor for that matter, as indicative of a lack of seriousness to the concerns thereof. To hold, for instance, that biological sexual distinctions do not matter can be to hold that there ought not be any such distinctions to be made. Call such gender abolition. Such ought be understood as a tendency towards total cultural genocide. Similarly, and in some sense more disturbingly, we may understand racial distinctions, that is, distinctions predicated upon skin color, and a bit more broadly, predicated upon phenotypology, in a similar manner. I want to give a brief, plausible bit of explanation to this. For the overwhelming majority of the human species history, for the overwhelming majority of people, life was lived within the confines of a short distance from where they were born. People did not interact with folks that looked different than the people around them, for the most part. Whatever cultural dispositions arose, in other words, must have arisen within that general context. Likewise, whatever neurological structures that may have developed, would have developed within that general context. Such may amount to a hardwiring of the brain structures, or, more optimistically, it may be merely a soft wiring of the brain structures. By hardwiring I mean something akin to a genetic coding that manifests itself in the structures of the brain regardless of environmental factors. By soft wiring, I mean that it is merely a brain structure that is oft expressed via a more generic genetic coding, but doesn't have a necessity requirement of its expression via the genetic underpinning. In either case, it is also clear that these tendencies are not universally applicable. There are, in other words, plenty of instances whereby the racist or sexist modality of thought is not present, or at any rate, is not meaningfully manifested. Dispositions towards interest in being with folks who do not look like those around whom one has grown up with is a thing. On a personal, ethical, and normative level in these kinds of discussions, discourses, and creative endeavors, of what else may we say of the species but that the correction of certain biological errors is a noble sort of aim for the philosophical knives we've at our disposal? Boom, 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 even brighter than the moon, moon, moon. That said, I want to remove the discussion from the genetic, nature/nurture sort of argumentation, to that of the way in which we have presented Flattish eartherism. Specifically, that when it comes to the issues of being presented with folks of differing skin colors, differing phenotypologies, there are really only so many modalities of interacting with and responding to them. Hence, we may expect that some percentage of those interactions will tend to take on the form of racism, others of interest, intrigue, sexual desire, etc. In this view of things, such dispositions are educationally bound. To grow up within a multicultural context entails that the exposure to folks with such nominal differences are included within the cultural dispositional structures briefly described earlier. In essence, they are more normalized, they become that against which difference is determined. This undercuts the range of plausible responses. For example, to grow up in a community with significant populations of black and white peoples entails the plausibility of growing up in a way that normalizes black and white peoples. Folks that are neither black nor white become the other. Of course, the plausibility of it doesn't entail the immediate necessity of it, and historically there are loads of examples whereby this doesn't happen. However, it is worth noting that those historical examples have largely, if not entirely, been subjected to the strict segregation of the peoples, as well as a host of various hostile modalities of interactions. Rare until recently in history have been those who transgress racial borders with intimacy, and rare too those who have been able to realistically experience these other peoples fairly directly, until recently. The internets in particular have provided for that plausibility. Within the context of this piece, the gentle readers ought note the relation to colonialism, specifically, the land-based modality of colonialism. The practice of living together, sometimes by force tbh, with an aim towards the eradication of even the possibility of the development of the racist dispositional interpretation of nominal differences. The privileging of the multicultural, multiracial view with a cultural genocidal tendency in mind, a supreme dream team. Call such the disposition against the reduction of the human species to its biology. Understanding that these kinds of factually correct aspects of the species' biology are nonetheless ethical errors, biological errors in the species' thinking. Truth, here, follows the ethics, the good, rather than the mirrorness of the factual structure. Falseness, perhaps, would be exactly to follow the biological errors, whereby their erroneousness is fundamentally a matter of their lacking in ethical goodness. More to the point, a bit more telling of the matter, to do so despite knowing better. It, perhaps, being one thing being born into such a situation, and we may suppose not really having much or any choice in the matter, and another thing entirely to have not been born into such a state, to have of oneself the actuality of choice in the matter, and yet to still choose the erroneous biological structure as one's preferred modality is to exactly choose towards the bad, evil, unethical, etc. In the current, the reader ought note the relevance of the internets to simulate the prospects of land-based colonialism, e.g. the modality to meaningfully interact with folks from other cultures in a wide variety of ways, in order to form an educational base that is inherently multiculturally, multiracially structured, thereby undercutting the cultural dispositions to view folks with differing phenotypes as being different than the nominal structure. The broken heart of biological errors, in such a reality as aforementioned, is a heart that can at least heal. What pathos of love's many bloomings and becoming led here? Need we really explicate such things? A racist's broken heart is a heart ethically healed, and far better form. What could be of the good but a broken heart of the racists? Perhaps that goes a bit too far, perhaps I have of me a bit of the zealot's love. But then, for us, fidelity of the heart depends rather strongly upon that towards which its fierce beating bleats. I hear in my mind all this music, and it breaks my heart. How fairly fiercely beats the fairies' hearts in their musings over broken things. If somehow that point isn't entirely clear, the reader ought consider what the introduction of the internet to a society that is currently isolated from all forms of media may entail. For instance, the few remaining tribes of people that haven't had contact with the outside world. Try to imagine the degree of cultural genocide that would occur if the internet were dropped upon them. The situation may be less severe in various cases whereby the grouping of people may already have access to some form of media or another. However, the cultural genocidal tendency of the introduction of the internet to them remains. Now, dear reader, try and recognize the degree whereby the culture that the reader is experiencing via the internets is exactly a culture that has and is currently going through a massive global scalar genocide. For the youth, this may not be overly apparent, given that they have grown up within the cultural paradigm the internet provides. Generationally speaking, the major differentiating grouping occurs with Generation X, at least in terms of the internets. Gen X being the primary users and in some meaningful sense the creators of the internet, though they did not actually grow up from the get-go within it. Conversely, anyone in Gen X or older likely has a relatively easy time recognizing, feeling, and indeed experiencing the reality of a cultural genocide. Begging the questions whose hands are shaken asking "Don't let my heart keep breaking" cause. There is a rather strikingly good thought experiment the reader can practice. If you were to come across a people, a culture, that held to some very odd belief, if, that is, you were the colonizer who came across some peoples who held something akin to the view of flattish earthers, what would you do? What kind of behavior towards them would you exhibit? If your immediate reactions are of the form "that dumb, that need go," then you have a sense of the issues associated with meeting new peoples, the potential horrors associated with colonialism, and the problems associated with integrating peoples. If your immediate reactions are of the form "that hot AF, what that, who that, can I try, let me show you what I gots too," then you have a sense of the potential goods associated with meeting new peoples. There is at least a third sort of reaction, not really a middling version of the previous two, but its own sort of thing, that responds critically towards both, and posits something other than either as a new kind of thing. Such positing of alternatives not necessarily stemming from the mereness of the critical analysis, but rather from such things as songs from another time. The transgression of borders through which, not particularly critically so analyzed, the reality of something is simply created. The specifics of such may be drawn out via this piece. There is related therein the disposition against the biology, against the horrors, against the racisms, the murderous, and towards something other than. An askewing of the previous possibilities. Such a view has a dependence upon some future-looking vision, within and through which peoples live. To paraphrase the poets, standing on the ocean, until we start sinking. Flattish earthers, how do we respond to ye? And so too, with the rest of thee? The major supposition on the ethicity of TPKing is that doing so is a perennial affair. That even if one cannot make you love me, ultimately there is no total victory to be had, and in virtue of that there is ethicity in the doing. In a more gentle way, just hold me close, don't patronize. Don't patronize me. In regards therefore to such things as racism, sexism, etc., more generally speaking, in regards to the arbitrary differentiations, we ought understand such as a very human kind of thing to do. It's a bit of a childish sort of thing, a bit of a nominal association towards the self-sameness as a norm, but nonetheless a very human kind of thing. It is the position of being within a given cultural perspective in an authentic manner. The disposition to believe in something as being true, or at least as having some kind of truthiness to it. It is to latch on to some aspects of the experiential reality within which the human finds themselves, and to normalize such as the basis from which the understanding of the rest of reality stems. To answer the questions, what is a woman, what is a man, what is a trans, etc., is to give something of the form of answer provided in the preceding paragraph. Such amounts to having a cultural disposition, some of which may be undesirable. Consider the degree by which such petty concerns may structure socio-cultural behaviors in a trivially unimportant, and trivially non-harmful way. That is, the cultural dance and mood of clothing. When taken seriously in the long term, such is utterly dreadful; when taken seriously in the short term, such is a high levity of joyfulness. To take the choice of clothing seriously in the long term is dreadful, unethical, yet to take it seriously in the short term is proper levity of form. In terms of the ethicity of what to wear, what kinds of clothing to put on, in what context to put them on, if and when to disallow this or that piece of clothing, or style of dress. It may very well be important to take such things seriously at times, in certain contexts. A kind of decorum to set the mood. To take such things seriously within that fairly well short temporal concern may very well be a good sort of thing ethically speaking. To take it seriously in a longer sort of context, however, may very well be quite dreadful ethically speaking. To hold, that is, that such styles and types of clothing ought to be held in serious regard in broad temporal contexts, in ways and means of place that are non-localized, can potentially be quite devastating ethically speaking. Oppressive, to put it in a word. Again, pointing to a generalized form of oppression, repression, etc. Something that folks in the relevant discourses ought to perk up to hearing, and applying with proper aplomb. Where such concerns are temporally, and hence too spatially, constrained, they evoke a mood, they set the stage for people to do something, anything at all. They can and perhaps ought be understood as costumes, but as costumes they ought not therefore be understood as particularly unimportant, at least as regards human life. The recognition of their ephemeral form can be somewhat disconcerting for folks who have come to take such things dreadfully seriously. That is, for folks who have taken such things as being of serious import beyond the proper temporal contexts of its ethicity. To such folks, they are clearly mistaken, they are beholding themselves to a piece of cloth as if the truth, the ethicity of it were a matter of something other than decorum, mood, the setting of a stage. The scale and scope of the decorum matters a great deal, again the seriousness with which one takes it leads folks astray. To hold as necessity and ethicity and temporality is to grossly miscategorize the purpose, beauty, and ethicity involved in the lessons of the cloth. Worse still, they are very likely beholding themselves to a piece of cloth as if its point were not to be able to take it off. What mood, when in the mood of love, after all, is there for such cultural songs and dances as the cloth allows, indeed enables and ennobles, but that it be taken off to reveal the skin, that other layer of clothing upon which the species depends? In the longer term, in relevant terms of racism, sexism, bigotry, cultural genocidal tendencies, what are these skins we have but exactly a kind of cloth we wear? The wearing of such perhaps taking on a longer sort of temporal form in its ethicity, but its ethicity nonetheless being in the taking off of those skins. Methodologies matter. To tear away the clothing of a potential lover is perhaps valid in certain contexts. To strip them, and be stripped of the outer layers of cloth are a norm and a good. Its ethicity lay where we lay most oft at any rate. The underlayer of clothing, the skins that dress up the species in its beauties and pragmatics of forms in this life, they too are taken off, in a fairly literal sense, occurring across a far longer temporal time frame. Here I mean, to be clear, the differentiations of the species' skins over time. Similarly too, as noted elsewhere in this piece, the stripping of the cultural coverings more broadly, stripped to the bone just to be naked as we came. Innocence. There is another relevant kind of concern here ethically speaking, namely, what if it is the case that that against which one is arguing, that against which one attempts a TPK doesn't necessarily return? That is, what if one can indeed be successful at a TPK of flattish earthers? And if not the flattish earthers, just some other cultural expression? Where and with whom to stand by when the night has come? Here we've set aside as essentially unethical a wide variety of colonialistic modalities of TPKing something, but we remain with at least the plausibly ethical colonialistic modalities of philosophical knifing, sharing of stories, sharing of technologies, educational practices, etc., noting, however, that each of these really are a kind of cultural genocide. The extinction of some species, some modality of life, some way of thinking about things, these are the kinds of things we are speaking of. It is tacitly spoken of when we speak of TPKing flattish earthers, sometimes rather explicitly spoken of when we listen to the zealots in their quests to exactly accomplish such a thing. After all, flattish earthers, those kind of folk simply do not deserve life now, do they? There is a rather obvious way of approaching this ethical question. If you were given the opportunity to TPK a species, understanding that by doing so, it would be a permanent death, would you? Here we are rather explicitly holding that flattish earthers cause no one any harm, so there isn't any ethical justification for the TPKing aside from the mereness of their factual incorrectness, and we are supposing that there is nothing ethically bad about being factually incorrect. So, the knife holders cannot realistically hold to any justification for the TPKing of the flattish earthers that they are necessarily doing anyone a favor. Musical musings, situational circumstances, suggestive suggestion? I'll be giving up my stripes, be painting with new colors beginning with dove white. Interestingly enough, such TPKers may contingently utilize such a justification. That is, there is very likely some unobvious save perhaps in retrospect goods that accrue towards the TPKing of flattish earthers, such has been argued, admitted, and alluded to already in this piece. Such is the correct kind of ethical justification for TPKing any sort of species, modality of living, way of thinking, etc. Still, here is a matter of form we are attempting to address the question at its most difficult. The prospect, for instance, of seeking out flattish earthers with the express intention of TPKing them, not because they themselves are harming anyone, themselves or anyone else, nor because there is anything of ethical wrongness about them beyond the mereness of their factual incorrectness. And if not the flattish earthers, then some other cultural expression, and more broadly cultural expressions in general. The notion of, for instance, the destruction of a dance in the literal sense, its forbidding by law, decree, etc., or its practical dismissal by peoples who simply find it not worthy of continuing, for why oh wherefore? Not after all because it has anything of unethicalness to it, but rather, because it is factually, objectively, ugly. Ugly because, after all, when speaking of something of such trivial import as a dance, we are merely concerned with its aesthetics. Indeed, ugly in the sense that it runs counter to the conceptualization of the aesthetics of simplicity and form, e.g. the aesthetical concerns of science. Though there is a solution to these already alluded to, namely that their ethicity is at best, most, least, and worst associated with the ethical praise/blameworthiness of aesthetics, and that the folks taking it overly seriously in any direction are actually committing a far more grave sort of ethical bad by mistaking the levities associated with aesthetical ethical considerations for the seriousness that accrues in regards to ethically obligatory sorts of reactions. Still, here the reader would do well to consider if there is anything within the levitied kinds of aesthetical ethical concerns that rises to the relevance of TPKing something with the intentionality that it may never return. Understandings such as occurring not via the categorical misapprehension previously alluded to, but rather, within the constraints of the levitied aesthetical ethical concerns at all. Blandly, perhaps a bit too trivially put, the TPKing of a particular aesthetic, understanding that the aesthetic so TPK'd is just as levitied as the aesthetic which wields the knife. If, in other words, there is so little of concern about the aesthetical consideration, it being just a piece of cloth, just a certain dance, etc., its loss being of little import, perhaps provided that it is replaced with some other aesthetical modality of living. Changing one's clothes, much like changing one's mind, not being an obvious sort of harmful thing. Such perhaps belies the reality of cultural genocide, where a dance and its accompanying song are worthwhile monikers for a description of a cultural practice in total. Perhaps its plurality of expression providing a bit more accuracy in the expression, e.g. the songs and dances of a culture. Again, the reader really ought not be fooled by the seeming triviality of the questions involved. To hold that there is justification for the eradication of a particular dance simply on the grounds of its aesthetics is to hold to a principle that cultural genocide along such grounds is at least possibly justifiable. Now, tempering that expression is relevant, here we are inquiring into the almost certainly harmless or at least mostly harmless act of dismissing a literal dance of some kind, to its utter destruction, that it may never occur again, simply on the very trivial and plausibly ethically uninteresting grounds that it is ugly. Moreover, such an inquiry is plausibly an inquiry into something that is near to, if not outright impossible. That is, it is likely that if not that exact set of dance movements, then something very much like it would inevitably arise despite all efforts at its eradication. If the sky we look upon should tumble and fall, and the mountains crumble into the seas. Such are the kinds of questions here. Triviality makes profundity. Still, the question is pertinent for several reasons. For one, it seriously poses all the pragmatic questions the species faces as a matter of colonialism and privileging, and these questions are going to be perennial to the species, so long as the species is regularly interacting across different cultures. Such questions are also pertinent as they relate rather directly to concerns regarding changing cultural expressions from whatever cause. So they say, "Dance for me, dance for me, dance for me, oh. I've never seen anybody do the things you do before." They say, "Move for me, move for me, move for me, I. And when you're done, I'll make you do it all again." To look upon one's own or another's culture's shitty song and dance and draw one's knife is the question du jour. If, that is, there is ethical permissibility or even imperative towards such a thing as a law against a practice, that is, an active concerted effort of some sort, the particular horrors involved in the practice entail that there ought to be some kind of justification as if the practice were to be eradicated in total. It is already argued for, and I think well enough, that to do so in jest, that is, with a light heart, understanding that such doesn't actually eradicate, entails a kind of ethical praiseworthiness to it. The parameters of such an action, however, being far more to do with the philosophical and practical aspects of living than with, say, a law of dictum. It is playfulness, play-fighting, wrestling with God. To have a law of dictum, to formalize a specific practice, to have as a matter of lawfulness the practice of, say, eradicating Flattish eartherism, however, entails a rather striking sort of enterprise with a set of horrors attached to it, for which anyone familiar with the questions of colonialism ought also be familiar with. Indeed, I'd go so far as to say that such bespeeches the horrors of the currents of economics, an entirety of living modalities summed up rather poorly under the umbrella laws of monies, dictums by the dollars. Perhaps we may hold the following: there is no such justification, beyond those already stated. It is something that happens, but it isn't something that happens with anything akin to good justification. Of mics and numbers. Thinkin' of all them kids that try to do this for all the wrong reasons. Seasons change, mad things rearrange. But it all stays the same like the love doctor, strange. As long as we're at it though, I can think of at least some kinds of aesthetic justifications for the eradication of this or that song or dance, beyond the mereness of its ugliness. Insofar as a song or a dance has some kind of purpose to it, some teleology to it, we may hold that it's lacking in even the possibility of obtaining that teleological aim, makes it deserving of being eradicated. It isn't that such a practice of the song or dance is harmful, nor for that matter is the dance ugly. Perhaps it is a very beautiful sort of dance, but if the dance has as its aim some kind of end, some purposefulness, and it is a known thing that the performing of such a dance will not obtain that towards which it is aiming, then we may hold such as being sufficient grounds to the praiseworthiness of its eradication. Such, after all, sounds an awful lot like the notion that it is failing merely in its factualness, plausibly related to the notion of biological errors. Eating some food that doesn't cause any harm, but which also doesn't provide any nourishment, that fails to fill one up at all, falters on its telos and hence ought not be continued. This seems plausible enough, provided of course that the teleological structure of a given song and dance is known. A dance done simply to dance, after all, has no further teleological structure to it than its dancing form. Wrestling with God, wrestling with the divine, after all, doesn't necessarily have any purported purpose to it beyond the mereness of the act of wrestling, a side-to-side kind of motion. We may surmise that the joyfulness of the wrestling is its aim, and I must admit that does at least in part seem to be its teleology. However, on a somewhat deeper level, its teleology may be more simply put as differing from the divine, differing from God, specifically for the difference it provides. Perhaps of the fictive, the purported teleological aim is exactly to differ. The mereness of its factual incorrectness, that is exactly its purported point. We may also ponder, and perhaps ought to ponder, the degree whereby in all pragmatics the productive output of such enterprises, such joyful expressions of living, is exactly something akin to, if not exactly that of truth. That is, when we speak of such things as the relations and relatas of the epistemic with the ontological sans the epistemic, we are speaking of such things as the truth-functional relations, and that the practice itself is tantamount to the productive virtues of truth, not as they are expressed via factualness or not, that, as has been shown, is not synonymous with either truth or the good, though it also is not necessarily irrelevant to the questions thereof, but rather that the virtues of truth and the good are found via such wrestling as the modalities of living. Not merely in the virtues of such wrestlings, though there may very well be such things therein, but also within the virtues and goods of differing modalities of living. And such not because this or that aspect has any particular quality to it, though of course we may also surmise that such differing qualities are sound grounds of further differentiation and hence too, such TPKing as has been under discussion here, but far more simply in the virtues of there being such differing modalities at all. We may hold, therefore, that there are goods and truths produced through such acts as these, and that they are goods and truths simply in virtue of their existence. That is, simply in virtue of their ontology, a deontological justification for the ethicity of good and truth that is not self-referential. A song and a dance is a good and a truth in virtue of its ontology. Such may be a bad, such may be a false, and such aspects as those require specifications on meanings, interpretations, and more fully formed other sorts of ethical considerations that are largely contextualized to the situation. Such is perhaps a bit too roughly cut by denoting that all and only those within a given song and dance are capable of knowing and understanding the relevant differentiations between the good and the bad, the good and the evil, the truth and the falseness of a given song and dance. Songbirds, you'll be in my heart, babies' lullabies. For you, there'll be no crying. For you, the sun will be shining. 'Cause I feel that when I'm with you. It's all right. I know it's right. Their ethicity, in short, as has been short-handedly used throughout this piece, is something that is determinable not merely via those who practice such a song and dance. The questions of colonialism, of which direction to favor, which movements to privilege, how to structure a given song and dance, are far more caught up already within the questions of otherness, the reality of others as also being an ontological structure, and likewise as also being an ontological good and truth, at least, prima facie. There may be, in other words, a singer and a dancer whom are synonymous, the one with the other, and perhaps indeed there may also be a third therein who is likewise synonymous with the others thereof. However, nonetheless there are differentiations therein that can and are made. On a less abstracted level, we may well note the pragmatics involved of a song and a dance, a singer and a dancer, and the relationship between them being its own thing. Moreover, the realities involved in dance whereby, sure, one can dance alone to some song, one can be sufficient and perhaps even satiated by such a practice. However, there is something more to it than all that, something further to it to be had, when such dancing and singing is done with others, through others, rather than the mere throughness of the self per se. Per vos, the rather straightforward notion that the self as such is such through another. Through you, whereby you is a generalized otherness reflexively understood in relation to the utterance itself. An utterance per se tacitly entails per vos. The supposition being presented here as summation is that insofar as TPKing tends towards actual eradication, it lacks ethicity to it. There is at least also the following to be surmised from the preceding: there is something of value within the unicorn cultures. The valuations and ethicities, that is, in the interplay between the epistemic and the ontic sans any epistemic is itself a kind of beautiful, truth-deriving enterprise, whereby truth is understood as something that transcends the mereness of factual analysis. The reality of the species' existence, in other words, is simply not reducible to the mereness of a factual analysis. To do so, the scientism alluded to throughout this piece is tantamount to a genocidal tendency that is to be avoided, which isn't the same as saying that there is no value to scientism of factual analysis. It is merely to denote such as being limited in its capacity for divining the truth of the matters at hand. The truth-functional relation en relatas produces per vos, which includes per se out of hand, but is simply not reducible to it. Rather than coming at this directly from the colonial perspective, I want to suggest that a wiser perspective is that of the child, and that of the reality within which the child is going to grow, providing that the internets, that communication structures that easily transcend the mortal bounds of nations, states, cultures, etc., are a norm. Understanding that from this perspective, we are also addressing the underpinning points of colonialism, as in each and every case the issues of colonialism are predicated upon the existence and growth of the child, of their children. The child still grows up, is born within the world, still has of themselves some things that are taught. They are still raised in some fashion, given some dispositions, told in some manner what they are, who they are, what to expect. Do we value diversity, y'all? Primarily, such begins in the home, such begins of course with the parents, more specifically, with who the parents are. What they do, what roles are they fulfilling, what lives they are living. These are the kinds of things that initially, but clearly not finally, shape the understanding of the children. Secondarily, that which is taught to them by their parents, in the more formal sense of teaching. That which is vocalized and explained, shown, demonstrated, those moral lessons taught, ethicity normalized. These kinds of things stem not merely from the parents, but also from those around them. Who are the family friends? What do they look like? How do they act, etc.? To borrow, beg or steal from some poet or another in the relevant regards. We may not yet have reached our glory, but I will gladly join the fight. And when our children tell their story, they'll tell the story of tonight. If the aim is to TPK racism in particular, and perhaps more generally the disposition to differentiate arbitrarily, exposing the children to the differentiations early is a simple and effective sort of way to do so. Such needn't be hammered upon with much more force than a tuning fork hammer requires. Having such folks present in their lives, treated normally as anyone else, with no big deal made of the matter is likely more than sufficient. Such may of course not be practical, but then, it is incumbent upon the parents to make it practical. To go out of their way to exactly introduce the stranger in real life as much as is plausible. Insofar as such is not plausible, relying on the media to provide representation of such folks is of real importance. Understanding that as parents, here we are speaking primarily of little ones in the single-digit age range, perhaps even on the younger side of that limited range. So the aspects of this are not intended to be particularly highbrow in terms of learning. It is understanding that for such little ones the reality of their development is exactly to differentiate fairly arbitrarily, predicated upon such amazingly insightful things as skin color, sexualized body types, basic roles that people do, how mom and dad or mom and mom or dad and dad, etc., interact. Insofar as these are done, actualized, performed before them, so too are they taught. For folks not so blessed as to have an in real life diversity of peoples around them, understand that there is virtue and value in maintaining a culture. This is a rather delicate matter, how to teach a culture, how to pass on a culture, without inculcating arbitrary differentiations within the children. Importantly, provided there is the internets, such inculcations will have a somewhat less informalization to them. That is, ultimately, the children will be exposed to a wide variety of differing cultures, supplementing their normalized childhoods whereby they may have thought and indeed even been taught to believe that they are the normal ones. The point therein being, rather bluntly put, that the concern regarding interactions with the strangers these days, and assuming the internets persists, is significantly lessened. The concern within that particular reality is the capacity for a given cultural expression to survive. To what extent, in other words, is it the case that such delicate things as cultural dispositions, beliefs in this or that, stylistic choices, lifestyle choices, choices on gendered roles, dispositions towards friendships, etc., are endangered exactly by such exposures? Of these kinds of delicate things, are they not dream makers, heartbreakers along moon rivers and shores of sunshine? Is the following the case? That all such dispositions are exactly childish? But not therefore wrong either. To raise a child is to raise them within childishness. How much of such things are akin to the unicorn cultures, after all? Is there not something at least partially odd about the adults who persist within such things? Let us refer to the supposition of the final product, e.g. the adult. The adult nonetheless expresses the childishness, even as they are aware of it. What choice do they have, after all? In terms of style of dress, we may very well suppose, and not wrongly so, that such is little more than a choice. And yet, expressing such at all, one must make some choice in the matter. To hold to any given style whatsoever, one must actually have of themselves that matter of decision to do so. Perhaps such amounts to little more than a taste, little more than a choice among limited options, and there isn't any reason why one cannot change their mind and express some new style, some new dress. But, insofar as one is expressing themselves via clothing, well, one must put on something to make the expression via the cloth. Of course, this isn't to suggest that one must put on clothing. Putting on clothing is itself a choice after all. Higher loves needn't needs or musts, to my huckleberry friend. Think about it, there must be higher love. Down in the heart or hidden in the stars above. Without it, life is wasted time. Look inside your heart, I'll look inside mine. But the point perhaps is best understood as how does the adult relate to the child in terms of the choices they are making in such matters. That is, what style is one presenting to the children? Is anyone giving the children a chance to have a style at all? Absent any sort of presentation, the children nonetheless put on some style or another, through such things as their peers, adverts, other adults, etc., and likely too, via their own emotive and intellectual dispositions that may lay at their base. But the point is that the children do initially and for a long time exactly look to and learn from their parents for determinations of such things. Indeed, for quite some time children are so oblivious to the notions that they are literally dressed by their parents, their clothing chosen for them. To such an extent that absent their parents doing so, they may not even really be capable of doing so themselves. Granted that such is a relatively brief period of time in the lives of children, and it is somewhat debatable as to exactly how influential such things ultimately are upon the children as they grow up, but at some point or another, they exactly are influential. The broader view is something very much akin to the following: inculcating a cultural normative practice within the home, with the expectation that others are doing similar, and with the aim that as the children grow, as they become adults, they will meet each other. The ethical concern of note is on how those meetings occur rather than as much upon what the cultural normative behaviors each has are. The notion rather blatantly is to foster the child that they may learn to firstly approach others with a non-genocidal tendency in their outlook, secondarily in a manner that encourages the sense of wonderment, interest, and appreciation for the differing cultures of others they so happen to meet, and tertiarily, though perhaps of some significance of import, the capacity to PK those kinds of cultural practices within themselves and within others that are not of this form, coupled with the capacity to actively create cultural practices via a sense of synthesis. In some sense, the practice has a fair amount to do with teaching exactly this sort of ethic, rage against the biological errors. Per Voss, the actions folks take towards each other fundamentally form the cultural structures within which the actions per se occur. Hence, the actions per Voss entail already the structural form of the actions per se, thus the ethicity of actions per Voss entail the ethicity of actions per se. More contextually relevant, the intercultural actions entail the creative structural form for the intercultural actions. How folks interact across cultures will come to be creatively defining of how folks interact within their own cultures. Such amounts to the supercultural structures as being defining of the cultural structures. More broadly, the scalarly larger, grander forms being structurally defining of the scalarly smaller forms. The raising of the children towards the raising of children. Iterative form of the species. What criteria in mate selection? Kindness, lovingness, good lover, willingness to help, and someone to whom you are able to reciprocate such things with. Though, of that latter point, such suggests that there are some other people one ought not, the ethical concern therein being that one ought to as a good lover do exactly those sorts of things as a matter of course. These kinds of criteria don't concern themselves with such amazeballs things as race, class, gender, or cultural expression. By cultural expression we are including a lot of other kinds of things, e.g. the various strange beliefs and opinions that folks may have. Flat earthers deserve love too, winky face. The real concern, the plausible point of tension in ethical merit amounts to the degree whereby folks do not practice these kinds of things. Much as is the case regarding intercultural relationships in general, the issues that arise relate far more to how those cultural expressions relate to each other, rather than what those cultural expressions are. The rather straightforward expected outcome thereof being an intertwining of the people's otherwise differing cultural practices. This notion is something of a strong counterpoint and pragmatic aspect of the issues being raised in this piece. In a very important sense, the reality of people's lives is far more about the intertwining of their loves and sexualities with each other, the construction of their lives in the day-to-day, than the larger scalar aspects of culture. The abstraction of culture, in other words, is in a meaningful sense far more divisive than the actualization of it in a love's relation, especially within a sexual or familial love's relations. Folks who take the abstraction as if it were the reality of their everyday, the reality of their love's relations, are doing it poorly. Such raises, or rather maintains the question of how those larger scalar abstracted cultural constructs interact with each other, though I would suggest that much of that has also been explicated here as a matter of TPKing Flattish eartherism. In real pragmatic terms, in the lives of real people, the point here regarding actual relationships with people is far more important. To actually ethically culturally interact entails at its core the actual sexual interaction, the intertwining of familial forms and norms, in a manner that is not genocidal in its expression. I am reminded of the kindness ethic to be shown to strangers, the opening of the home to them, and indeed, the opening of the bedchamber to them as a matter of courtesy. Something that was understood not as an imposition upon the home or the bed, but rather as a kind of celebratory, levitied, joyful frolicking. An opportune opportunity for those within the home to experience the stranger in a most intimate of manners. It is of course of some relevance to note that the stranger back when these notions were originally written was a relatively rare sort of occurrence. The stranger tended to be male, or at any rate, it was exactly that notion that prevailed. There is a serious sense in which this kind of notion could be viewed as quite liberating, sexually speaking. The disposition that women do not have a sex drive, or that they ought not enjoy sexuality, being something of a terminal disorder in a society. That is, if it is the case that women enjoy sexuality, then it is highly plausible to view such customs and cultural norms as a rather strikingly sexually liberated sort of view. Moreover, the cultural practice makes good the practice of sexuality occurring outside the bounds of marriage. A fairly well-balanced plumbing cultural practice that dignifies the sanctity of marriage, maintaining it as a long-term sort of relationship, maintaining, that is, the familial form, while also giving space in a non-destructive manner to the muses of loves and sexualities beyond and additive to the familial form. Folks in the West, unfamiliar with this kind of tradition, appear apt to find it distasteful, even as they celebratorily content themselves with fucking as many strangers as they can happen themselves upon. There is, of course, also a serious sense in which this notion could be abused, whereby the women were treated as though the rights of the stranger were a daily sort of experience, where the woman is made to be a prostitute rather than a lover of others. Hence, the notion, and possible abuse thereof, that a wife has an obligation as a hostess within the home to be sexual with the stranger. Moreover, somehow not often the discourse on this topic or kind of topic is the emotive and sexual needs, wants and desires of the husband. The discourse, in other words, as is oft the case, suffers from a basic failure in most gendered analysis, whereby the onus of concern one way or another is about the women. In the cultural norm here, as briefly alluded to, the notion of the stranger was a male, for the plausible reason that at the time it was originally written the stranger really did tend to be a male. Such is not particularly relevant these days, e.g. that sort of gendered aspect of the levitied ethical norm being described is not relevant. The lady stranger to the home as much as the male stranger to the home ought be just as welcome to the home and the bedchamber for much the same kinds of reasons and reasoning alluded to here. The unfortunate reality that this striking, lovely, beautiful sort of levitied aesthetical ethical practice is derided by folks predicated upon a host of things: Islamophobia, hypervigilance, the feminine demur towards power, the masculine inclination of dominance, predispositions towards the cult of the self, cultural hatred in general, certain prudish movements and moralistic crusades in the feminist cultures, and misconstruals of a wide variety of holy texts, looking at the Judeo-Christians. Here, all coupled with a miasma of disgust stemming from the heterosexuals towards the non-heterosexuals, while that unfortunate reality mostly highlights the actual value, worth, means, and measure of exactly this kind of levitied aesthetical ethical concern within the bedchamber and the home. All the unrighteous align themselves against it, therefore, you can be certain of the ethic's validity, goodness, holiness, and importance to the world. I do not want to dwell overly much on the plausibly negative aspects by which such a delicate levitied cultural norm could be abused. After all, most any cultural norm could be abused. Sexuality as such can become abuse. That ought not necessarily entail that sexuality as such is abuse, nor again, that the cultural practice is abusive. Less still that we ought thereby hold sexuality as a negative. Guarding against that disposition is important. Nor ought we to particularly consider this a relevantly gendered sort of issue. That is, just because in the tradition of note it was a man that came to a home and a woman who met them, ought not entail that either the woman nor the man were being put upon. Rather, each were being granted a kind of celebratory joyfulness in their sexual expression. Nor, for that matter, ought we assume that the husband didn't also partake in such pleasures with the stranger in the home. That men went from home to home, and women took them in from home to home, doesn't entail that either sex were being abused or disproportionately sexual or sexualized. At least, not in theory at any rate. That it is something that is culturally taught also doesn't entail that there is anything coercive about the practice. Indeed, folks may very well view such a cultural practice as a sublime sort of beautification of the acts of sexuality and love's many bloomings. The welcoming in of the stranger being, after all, among the principal points of order and concern regarding the fundamental issues of racism and various genocidal tendencies. There is that tendency alluded to, the feminine demur, the womb-guarding practice, which to be sure has significance in its import, but which falters in the face of effective modern birth control. Such a tendency forms one grounding of the biological errors that root in racism. The fear of the stranger, indeed, the irrational, even crazed fear of the stranger, most prevalently expressed within the feminine, even if it may violently manifest itself via their lovers who protect them and their virtue against the stranger. May not, ought not, we to look upon such a practice as described as a combating of exactly this kind of tendency? A teaching against the feminine demure, the masculine protectiveness, against the biological error in thinking that stands in the way of love's and sexuality's many bloomings. In either case, those genocidal tendencies of central focus in this piece. Such sounds rather of some striking importance in especially today's world of dating, loves, and sexualities. After all, how oft is it the case in the currents that folks expressly open their homes for strangers to come inside? That such occurs as a discussion between the occupants within the home in the first place merely entails that there is a teaching and a practicing of a cultural norm going on. After all, among the most sore and sorely misused notions of a cultural practice is that it is supposedly obeyed without thought, discussion, reason, or variation. And hence, too, amongst the issues associated with the criminalization of cultural practices. But then here rather bluntly, the suggestion is that this sort of cultural practice, the sharing of the bed with the stranger, the multiplicit loves relations has of itself a good associated with the TPKing of racism in particular. But also, realistically, of bigotry regarding sexual practices more generally, and sexism understood as a byproduct of habitus relations between the sexes. Folks in the currents of the dating, loves, and sexualities relations ought well hear within themselves their own predilections towards the sexual sensuousness of the stranger. How inculcated and facilitated those cultural dispositions are within the currents of the internets. How culturally taught, defined, and refined within the notions of sexual liberations, freedoms of choice, individualism, etc., those notions really are. Likewise, how they are and can rather easily be made within the constraints of long-term relationships. That is, how deeply appealing, if perhaps scary, such things as kitchen polyamory can be, along with its various subsidiaries and familial form. Those emotive states that are brought up within yourselves at the prospect of it all. Those habituated norms of cultural states that arise. What difference is there between the emotive and such things as cultural habits? Those emotive states, the disposition to want, to be desirous of such things, and likewise the disposition to abhor, to be fearful, overly worried, self-conscious, etc. It is the pushback against those lesser emotive states, the states of the overly timid in loves and sexualities, the feminine demure and its masculine counterpart, that are in question here. How far those particular emotive habituses have harrowed humanity. They are comfortable and comforting sorts of things, but then, how fearful they make one of the stranger. Folks in the know should hear well the conversations surrounding safe spaces. The practices in the sex-positive cultures to try and appease those emotive habituses. To make sure they feel comfortable, the cries for ever more stringent, even absurd needs for consent. Where even the prospect of something being out of place is perhaps too much for the emotive state to maintain. The fear of the stranger is palpable, the ground for racism, bigotry, sexism, nationalism is being made fertile again. Salt the ground, make love with strangers in bed with longtime lovers. To quote the poets, come and find your lovers underneath the covers. I want to direct the reader's attention to the ethics of aesthetics. The reason being that a fair amount of the songs and dances of cultural practices are aesthetically concerned. Though folks ought not take that too capriciously. We may hold of course that of ethics in aesthetics there are none. That in ethic there is ludicrous. It's just aesthetics, after all. Its value is purely subjective, merely reflective of a culture. Its standards are within the judgments of people and people alone. There are no true aesthetics, and so on and so forth. The blunt fractal point is that insofar as reality is fractally structured, it is thereby structured via principles of aesthetics. Beauty is a structural feature. Hence, it ought be expected to be the case that the ethical concerns will have an aesthetic aspect to them, e.g. they are understandable as concerns about the aesthetics, for the aesthetics are what defines the fractal structures, and the fractal structures define to some degree or another the formal structure of the reality. The whys and hows that a given fractal structure is crafted, guided, enacted, etc., all matter as a matter of the essence of ethical concerns. To understand the whys and hows of fractal structuring of the species, more broadly, of reality, is to understand the essential structures of ethical consideration. To understand the pragmatics of how those structures interact with each other post-creation amounts to a kind of pragmatic ethical concerns, commonly denoted as materialistic kinds of concerns, and likewise such common ethical theories as harm reduction and utilitarian analysis. The biggest risks involved with those sorts of ethical considerations is essentially a tendency toward stasis of form, a failure of basic temporal relevance in analysis. They tend to, in other words, fail to consider the plausible ethics that may matter as a matter of the essence of how fractal structures are formed and altered. They tacitly take for granted the fractal form as it is, the cultural expression therein as it is, without due consideration to the broader fractal structures involved, indeed temporally speaking, which, without any argument here for it, amounts to fractally speaking, the ethical considerations are simply off. They tend to take the immediate, the hedonistic line of thought as if that were the entirety of the temporal and ethical considerations. But here I want to hold to a certain kind of principle within aesthetics, that insofar as we are ethically concerned with aesthetics, we are concerned with the principles of creativity. What is, in other words, ethical about aesthetics is exactly that which is ethical about creativity. As a matter of deontological ethical concerns, all issues of aesthetics may be understood as issues of deontological import insofar as 1. The ontology is creatively structured. 2. Insofar as the ethics are reflective of the aesthetic. To one we may ponder a fair amount on the ramifications of a creatively structured ontology. There is undoubtedly some degree of creativity inherently structured within the ontology, if we are to take the following as real. 1. History. History changes. There are meaningful differences in the historical record. Insofar as there are changes, it follows that the ontology has some creative structure to it. We may note a huge variety of changes, but here I merely want to point out a few. 1a. Technological developments. Technology doesn't grow from trees, so to speak. It is not a phenomenon that occurs sans the epistemic of the human species. Note critically that distinction again, between the epistemic ontical and the ontic sans any epistemic. 1b. Biology changes, evolutionary happenings, happen. 1c. Aesthetics change. 1d. The universe as a whole has some changing aspects to it, e.g. stellar phenomenon, solar system, galaxies, etc., change. With an important historical aspect thereof, for most of the species' history, the heavens were understood exactly as unchanging. Their stasis in form being something well documented, and indeed, their regularity of formal movements being such as the very means by which the human species has tended to grasp at an understanding of temporality, eternity, etc., as something beyond the rhythmic motions of life on the planet. 2. Temporality. History as a concept is reflective of and dependent upon temporality. Here we are holding rather explicitly that it is beneficial to understand temporality as a fractal structure. That is, what people mean when they refer to temporality is the reality of iterative processes that emerge as fractal forms. each of the preceding AD can all be described in fractal terms. Their historical shape, that is, their formal temporal forms, are rather blatantly fractal. In shorthand, but not thereby particularly missing any relevant points, they are all self-similarly structured rather than self-samely structured, and they're all formed through iterative processes. Folks familiar with the phrase history doesn't repeat but it rhymes can get a good sense of what is meant by holding to the position that temporality is fractally structured. Note that at this point, the connectivity, self-similarity, or identification of temporality as fractally structured is given a great deal of explanation, argumentation, and discussion in other pieces. Such would stray too far from this particular piece to do so though, so I'll largely leave the point for here. 2a. Relevantly for much of this piece, the human species is understood or understandable as a broad scalar fractal form that emerges through the iterative processes of sexuality and love's relations. Hence, what is ethically of concern as a matter of the human species is generally and or primarily grounded within the sexuality and love's relations. Then we can hold that the ontology has some creative structuring to it. There may very well be fundamental structures that are not creatively structured, e.g. that are fundamental or foundational to creativity, and hence too, to temporality, etc. But here we are speaking of whatever ethical considerations may be present within the creatively structured ontology. We can also note the rather obvious creative elements associated with ethics as follows. 3. It is the case that there are a multiplicity of modalities of ethical considerations. Roughly, cultural relativism is a reality. It may or may not be the beginning and end of ethics, but that there are differing ethics predicated upon cultures that differ over time entails that there are some ethical considerations that inhere within aesthetic concerns. 3a. Note that this point hinges upon the previous point, e.g. that history as such changes via creative structures, and that aesthetics is among those things the species specifically refers to when it refers to creativity. There are a variety of somewhat obvious plausible ethics of concern, as they relate to aesthetics and creativity. The issues, for instance, that may accrue relative to the time frame within which the discussion is happening. How time-dependent truth, truthiness, good, bad, etc. may be, as is discussed elsewhere in this piece. What may be ethically relevant within a given time frame may not be so within some other time frame. Here the reader ought to understand these kinds of things, time frames and scalarly relevant entities such as cultural states and the relative relativity of such things as truth, truthiness, etc., as being strongly related to the aforementioned fractal structure. We may speak of, for instance, the ethicity of such and such an activity within a given cultural disposition, within a given time frame, and yet that merely is descriptive of the fractal states thereof. The triviality or lack thereof for a given cultural disposition can likewise be fruitfully understood as being relative to the time frame within and through which the disposition is occurring. What is of trivial relevance within one scalar may be of non-trivial importance within another. Its triviality, its commonness itself being of aesthetic and ethical importance to it. In the context of this piece, the application of the PK towards something in the incorrect state of triviality to it is of significant ethical concern. See also the point on the dance, and the misapprehension of aesthetical ethical praise/blameworthiness with that of concern about ethical obligatoriness of actions. These all being related phenomenon and conceptualizations. Such is analogous to the notions of little t truth, cultural relativism in general, and in terms of fractal structures, such is indicative of a certain cultural outgrowth of a given underpinning norm of human sexual and love's behavior in particular. Such speaks towards something that strikes me as fairly relevant to the point in a bit more visceral a fashion. The emotive structures of life, I want to hold that these kinds of things are foundationally ethically of concern, and aesthetically formed. Bluntly, that what is ethical about them is their aesthetic. The value, the ethic of concern thereof, being in the existential state of being, deontologically speaking, rather than anything in particular they do, anything in particular they are, their utility, their harm or lack thereof. Their aesthetic is their ontology, and their ontology is their ethicity. What is of value in the ontological state of being of a feeling, of a mood, of an emotive state, is its aesthetic. Whereby we are rather explicitly holding that at least on a first pass-through, we are understanding aesthetics as fractal structures, bluntly dynamic asymmetrical iterative processes with the specifics thereof as they relate to human cultural ethical concern, the sexual and love's relations. Those kinds of emotive states being the underpinning iterative processes whereby the species' existence, within its bodily form at any rate, is iteratively produced. With relevance to the conceptual, the notion broadly under consideration here, the intellectual, the concerns of the TPKing of something, the withholding of the knife, its ethical use, etc., we are speaking just as bluntly about the love's relations, inclusive to but not so limited to, the sexual love's relations. That is, the conceptual love's relations, how such ephemeral things as differing worldviews may come to make love to each other. Which love's relations may be untold, unwanted, which may be consensual, interesting, wanting and wanted, how to make such love ethically speaking, etc. In all such cases, the reader can have in mind a somewhat crude but also somewhat apt notion of a given cultural disposition as an expression of an emotive state that is a derivative of a wide variety of previous iterative interactions. Its relevant ontology for consideration of its ethicity being its emotive dispositional state. The emotive state is crafted idiosyncratically to the underpinning cultural structure, yet it is fairly easily comprehensible across cultural grounds. To be within an emotive state has of itself a kind of ontology that is different than, other than, the ontology sans any epistemic at all. The aesthetical considerations are, in other words, much as the good, truth, etc., caught up in the reality of the interrelation between these sorts of things. The meaning associated with something, beyond noting that that thing over there is a rock, adheres within the playfulness, seriousness, the levities and in some the emotive relatas between the epistemic and the ontic sans the epistemic. The ethics, while likely not synonymous with the aesthetic, nonetheless also adhere within the aesthetic as such. We may point to, in this or that way, a variety of rationalistic, not necessarily aesthetic formulations of ethical concerns that are plausible, and yet, the aesthetic formulation, the emotive formulations structurally form at least some significant aspect of the phenomenological structure. What is of the ethical within the aesthetic may very well be synonymous with the mood, with the emotive. Though, I am somewhat hesitant to adhere to that claim, as there is at least the possibility of relevant aesthetics that are not particularly beholden to an emotive concern, though this remains unclear. Of relevant note, as it is popular within the sciences, discourses on truth, fact, fiction, etc., the aesthetic of simplicity, Occam's razor, those kinds of notions are fairly fundamentally attached to much of what folks would tend to call an objective, emotionless kind of view. But of course it is laden with a wide variety of emotive concerns, perhaps not least of which are among those under discussion in this piece, a kind of genocidal responsiveness to such things as cultural expressions, of differences of any sort, an almost maniacal desire to make the world in its own image, at whatever cost, through the eradication of anything that may be of a differing sort of view. Regardless of the absurdity of their doing so, that is, despite, again, the utter absurd position whereby they have placed themselves, to look squarely upon something before their eyes, and say that does not exist. We may, indeed, hold that the only thing that could possibly uphold such a disposition is their emotive state. They are, in other words, contained with the truth of the matter. Their sheer absurdity entails that they couldn't possibly adhere within the ontology sans the epistemic. Such a disposition would dissipate upon the barest of breaths if it lacked the solidity of its form within the epistemically ontologically valid. The questions thereof, though, after all, being what sort of emotive states are these folks adhering to, what is the ethicity of their doing so? There is, at least the ethicities associated with their aesthetical states, the beauties that they have of themselves with their rather simplistic viewpoint. In virtue, we may hold, of their very difference, their emotive mood beheld within a disposition of disdain towards the other. It is too cluttered, too messy, there is a lacking of simplicity to its form, it is overly complex, it is wet when the dryness of the deserts are sought. Nature, after all, is lazy, and would rather do the minimum. Its aesthetic of tastes, the austere. Something easy to grasp at, as if no one has yet grasped at it before. Again, it looks upon a rock and in all seriousness holds it up as something novel, new, afresh, and says proudly of itself, "Look, a rock." Yes, little one, ROCK. All of science, rationality, reasonableness of thought, held upon an emotive disposition. I can't help falling in love with you and at last, 'cause, after all, life is like a song. At last, I mean seriously, watching such folks slowly struggle towards something akin to a kind of understanding that has been available to them at a whim, there is a sigh of relief in watching them cross the finish line. How quickly, deeply, freshly, and with aplomb we cut when we cut to the feeling. Perhaps, too, we may muse well that the tide is turning. Next, I want to direct the reader to the prospects of understanding the aesthetic ethical concerns, the creative sorts of ethical concerns, with the notion of a fractal structure of the ontology. In abstraction, we are speaking of the ethics associated with pattern construction, maintenance, and how patterns shift. The ethicity thereof having much to do with the pragmatics associated with living, e.g. that insofar as the reality is in point of fact fractally structured, it follows that the pragmatic ethical concerns will have of them some relation to exactly that fractal structure. Similarly, indeed, self-similarly so, the ethics will have a relation to beauty broadly construed, as what we are referring to when we refer to the beautiful, the sublime, etc. is exactly or self-similarly that of the self-similar relation that defines the patterned structural form of the fractally structured reality. Without much argument for it here, noting that in the mathematically representation of the self-similar structure of fractal forms, such as a fractional dimension, and this piece is broadly holding that it is that fractional dimension that is structurally formative of the fractal forms in the reality, more specifically that such is the temporal dimension. In somewhat less abstracted terms, we can refer to the ethical concerns of the aesthetics as a matter of relations to the maintaining of some aspects of a fractal form, and the movements between fractal forms of living, whereby such movements and understandings are, at least at first blushing glance, somewhat synonymous with the cultural expressions of the human species. Such is rather blatantly anthropomorphic, but then what this piece is largely concerning itself with is the ethics of the human species. We can in passing note that such is hardly a novel take in the philosophies, e.g. what is ethical is delimited to those aspects of reality that have agency of the relevant sort. Humans are those sorts of agency-bearing beings, and hence ethics is primarily, though perhaps not exclusively, concerned with the human species. The human sense of beauty is the relevant sense, in the literal and figurative sense, by which such ethical aesthetic concerns are understood. What is the beautiful, and what is the ugly, what is the sublime, what is the profane, etc. These are things that, for the human species, depends on their capacity to sense such things. What they are sensing when they sense such things is, to be blunt about it, the temporality aforementioned as the self-similarity relation. Such a sense carries within the sense of temporality, as it is exactly not a sense of the thing in itself, e.g. it is not a self-simile, point-like relation, but rather is a sense that is always in relation to some other. Its similarity being an aspect that is sensuously defined in relation to some other existing sort of thing. In the parlance of the sciences, such is something that occur and indeed accrues through time because it occupies spatiality in a non-point-like manner. Its identity is sensuous in that what it is defined per vos, that is, through another, rather than per se, that is, through the self. This is not the same thing as holding that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, or that what is beautiful is relative, at least, not in the relevant sense thereof. Its existence is perhaps we may muse relative in the scientific parlance of that phrase, but then, that is not the same sort of usage, it is merely a self-similarly structured kind of understanding. The sense of temporality, therefore, is the capacity to sense the beautiful, sublime, profane, etc. These kinds of structures that transcend the immediacy of experience by their very form. The ethicity therein comes forth in some rather striking ways. In human societies, we are speaking rather directly towards such things as cultural norms, styles, emotive states of being, and also such things as gendered roles, racism, nationalism, bigotry, etc. A straightforward view on the matter would hold that the self-similarly structured form itself gives at least the semblance of a dichotomous understanding, e.g. the binary forms, such as left/right, up/down, in/out, man/woman, on/off, true/false, existent/non-existent, etc. To be clear on the matter, these are, at least in form, structurally predicated upon the fractal nature, temporality, and hence, are sensed in a real sense via the human sense of aesthetics. Such a notion entails that the ethics therein are temporality restrictive, as has been noted elsewhere in this piece. In regards to ethics, understanding what time frame we are concerning ourselves with is rather crucial to understanding what sorts of ethical considerations, concerns, and solutions we may derive. Such also is strongly suggestive of the aforementioned levitied kind of aesthetic ethical considerations, the praise/blameworthy sort of ethical concerns. Bluntly, that the fairly dichotomous kinds of understanding of ethics may actually be of the praise/blameworthy sort as a matter of categorical consideration, rather than of the ethical obligatory sort. Importantly, the aforementioned binary structure does not completely describe the fractal structure, and indeed, much of what the species takes for granted as binary in form is merely seemingly so. A byproduct of a somewhat overly simplistic sense of the aesthetic. Up and down, for instance, is truly a term with little meaning beyond the confines of a gravity well. Left and right are terms whose meaning is entirely relative to a being that is roughly at least seemingly merely symmetrically structured, and indeed, relative so only along one axis of the symmetrical structure so supposed. Granting that on/off, truth/falsity, man/woman, and existent/non-existent are likely more contentious as being predicated upon such seemingness, these days at any rate, each are indeed merely predicated upon a kind of seemingness. Although a good deal of attention has been given to the truth/falsity in this piece by way of which the gentle readers could draw forth the point that such binary distinctions are indeed predicated upon the mere seemingness of the symmetry that inheres within a sense of aesthetics, for the others for the most part one shall only say that similar applies to them as well. Each, that is, of these binary notions, no matter how fundamental they may seem, are merely derivatives of a sense of aesthetics that doesn't hold to a particularly well-founded understanding of even the aesthetics as such. Fractal forms, their structures, to be blunt about it all, are not binary structures in their totality, though clearly they can include such binary structures. Although the presentation given here is holding that the temporal dimension is the fractional dimension of the aesthetics, such needn't be accepted in order to grasp at the principles being espoused. Insofar as the reality is fractally structured, it follows that the fractal dimension is a reality, and whatever else one may say of it, such a dimension is not binary in its form. Indeed, it also isn't even linear. The upshot, as regards the ethics of the aesthetics, that what is ethical therein is also not binary nor linearly structured. It is exceedingly tempting to hold that the binary of good and evil, which are broadly understood as the relevant ethical terms of obligatoriness, are likewise merely artifacts of the poorly understood aesthetics. I'd go so far as to say that some of that is almost certainly the case, e.g. cultural relativism is a reality as regards such things as ethics. Such seemingness of the forms as if they were ethically relevant entail a seemingness of the ethics as if it were good and evil. Though note that a great deal of this point is understandable exactly via the misapprehension and hence the conflation of the levitied aesthetic ethical concerns with those of the obligatory ethical concerns, whereby doing so one not only misapprehends the fundamental ethical structures, but one also thereby commits egregious ethical harms. To wear this or that, to express gender in this or that way, etc., all can carry with it the ethical imperative as if it were indeed a very serious sort of imperative. As if, that is, one way or the other were in fact good and the other or its absence were in fact evil. I perhaps go so far as to suggest that such misapprehensions of the aesthetic reality may constitute evil in the relevant sense, e.g. to assign as evil that which is merely different is in point of fact a misapprehension of the aesthetic, whereby that misapprehension in fact constitutes the evil, the wicked, the bad, the malformed. One such misapprehension being exactly this sort of binary thinking. Such amounts to a misapplication of the binary thinking, to be precise, as it relates to various scalars of temporal concern. This point is expanded upon elsewhere in this piece. Here we note that such amounts to taking overly seriously something that ought be taken with a great deal of levity, or the other way around, whereby the incorrect temporal scalar, temporal dimension, and hence self-similarly defining fractal dimension, is applied. To hold that this or that style is good is perhaps aesthetically relevant at a given time frame, with the appropriate levity attached to it. To hold that this or that style is good for all time is a very different sort of claim that applies to a vastly different temporal scalar. The latter is plausibly an instance of the evil without the scare quotes attached. The former is plausibly a case of the good without the scare quotes attached. The latter, likewise, is an inappropriate instance of the usage of the binary ethicity good and evil, though we may apply such a binary of ethicity to it from a metaposition that is thereby an appropriate sort of usage. The former is an appropriate sort of usage of the binary ethic as it is well formed within the fractal temporal structure, e.g. it is of the proper scalarly relevant aesthetic. It is perhaps fruitful for the reader to grasp at this sort of false binary by noting the formal structure of fractal forms as they relate to living beings. The structural creative process entails a self-similarity relation between adjacent aspects of the form. There is little reason to suspect that such doesn't also occur within the relevant brain structuring process, or perhaps the mind structuring process. We may hold therefore that the conceptualization of good and evil, of ethics in general, is likely to take on exactly this sort of formal structure. Much as with flattish earthers such may amount to a default state for the human brain, one that isn't exactly non-existent, but is rather more structurally relevant to the brain, perhaps the mind, rather than necessarily to the ontology sans the epistemic. More troublingly, such may amount to a kind of seemingness in the world, a modality of conceptualization that is endemic, and endemically a problem. Nonetheless, such also may amount to a crucial modality of thought, the capacity to exactly transcend the seemingness of such aesthetically derived binary understandings itself being derivative of that binary modality of thinking. The capacity, in other words, to recognize that something, anything at all, be wrong with the scare quotes, entails also the capacity to denote such things that are wrong without the scare quotes attached. And similarly for the good and the good. The strong suggestion here is that such aesthetically derived notions have of them at least their proper scalarly relevant placements in order to achieve an understanding of the good and the evil without the scare quotes. The novelty in this piece is to note rather directly that the ethicity of such obtains because of a poor cutting in the relevant philosophical sense of that phrase, whereby the wrong scalar is applied to a given sort of ethical concern, where the scalar is understood as a fundamentally fractal structure, experientially that of the aesthetic sense, ontologically that of temporality. While we may hold that such poor cutting is the cause of harms so accrued, the harms are not the reason why nor the foundation of the ethicity thereof. The harms are merely data, indications of the underpinning ethicity. Let's hold at least this up of facts, science. It is a stretch to hold that science reveals truth, or truthiness, but it is fairly well grounded to suggest that science can inform regarding the facts. Racism, sexism, bigotry. These are facts of life. They may be facts of biology. It is certainly the case that racism, sexism, and bigotry can be given scientific explanation of their origins. See previous sections on the topic. In brief, evolutionary theory provides a sound basis for why and how something very much like racism and sexism may come about, selectively selecting towards preferences. While that doesn't entail that all people necessarily adhere to that kind of process, it is a fairly reasonable proposition, such that folks may have a tendency towards preferring those who look similar to themselves, and more generally, folks who are in-grouped. Do we see such things in the dark? Little darling, in an imaginary future when the sun comes after the sky we look upon tumbles and falls, even there in the warmth of the sunlight, would such things matter even when they're seen? What a wonderful world it could be regardless of if you're a student. But then, the question is, or maybe, what do you know in that context? And here, right now with some voice to say, not lost but found? The similarly minded view, that is, the in-group dispositioning of peoples likewise can go a fair ways towards explaining various forms of bigotry and sexism, in each case preferencing the treatment of someone's predicated upon a kind of seeming safety of similarity to oneself. The familiarity of something providing a sense of normalcy and therefore a sense of safety to the people, along with a lot of other kinds of potential benefits. After all, being in the in-group entails that the most arduous hurdle to success in life in general has been overcome. The Cool Kids Club is a succinct and silly sort of way of grasping the notion, something so obvious that even my little ones knew it well enough. In any case, for this piece we shall be taking those notions as factually sound, scientifically valid sorts of understandings that are well represented within the relevant lit, and the various expressions of human life. And yet, such a disposition is resoundingly unethical. It lacks truth, or even truthiness. Those who make the choice towards such things, make choices of falseness, wickedness, badness, etc. The disposition to accept the realities of biology as if they were not merely factually relevant, but ethically sound, is a disposition towards exactly racism, sexism, and bigotry. The scientific explanation merely formalizes and intellectualizes a biological reality the species was already living within. In other words, it isn't as if the scientific explanation invented the disposition. It merely expressed them in a formalized way. Though the scientific disposition may in point of fact also be reflective of exactly that kind of disposition under ethical scrutiny here. The disposition to categorize predicated upon nominal differentiations is akin to, if not exactly that of, the scientific disposition. The reduction of peoples, things, etc., towards some formal nominal traits as a means of neatly categorizing them, being a monstrously industrially mechanical disposition towards the ethical faults of racism, sexism, bigotry, etc. In general, towards the feelings of disgust, hatred of the other, and a will to make or remake the world in some idiosyncratic image of itself, e.g. in the image of the self, per se. To accept evolutionary theory as factually sound is to accept racism, bigotry, and sexism as factually sound. To hold that the entirety of what is good, that is, what is ethical, is rooted within what is scientific factual soundness is to hold that racism, bigotry, and sexism are ethically sound. Racism, bigotry, and sexism are not ethically sound. Hence, scientific factualism isn't a sufficient basis for determination of ethicity. Or, it's the case that there are significant numbers of people who hold that racism, bigotry, and sexism are not ethically sound. Hence, the ethical considerations are not reducible to the biological concerns, and hence are not reducible to the merely factual considerations. In either case, the upshot is that the ethics are not reducible to the biological reality, and hence too, the basic evolutionary theory, the in-grouping, etc. There are of course other ways that evolutionary theorists may move to adjust their theories towards a view that is more inclusive of the ethical considerations. But in this case the point is far more about the form of ethical considerations, and specifically the notion that the ethical considerations transcends factual considerations. What that say, after all, about such factual considerations as evolutionary theory howsoever construed? Hello, I got something to tell you. But it's crazy, I got something to show you. So give me just one more chance, one more glance, and I will make of you another believer. Guess what? You got more than you bargained. Ain't it crazy? You got more than you paid for. So give me just one more chance, one more glance, one more hand to hold. And it's not what I asked for. Sometimes life just slips in through a back door and carves out a person and makes you believe it's all true. And now I've got you. And you're not what I asked for. If I'm honest, I know I would give it all back for a chance to start over and rewrite an ending or two for the girl that I knew. And yet, hold me close and hold me fast. This magic spell you cast. This is La Vie en Rose. When you kiss me, heaven sighs. And though I close my eyes, I see La Vie en Rose. Simply examining the historical take on the issues of racism, sexism, and bigotry already provides a sense whereby the ethical considerations transcends the existing factual considerations, e.g. the dispositions on the subject have in fact changed predicated upon exactly the ethical considerations. We may very well hold, and indeed ought seriously consider, that the modality of cultural movements, the modality of the species' capacities for change are exactly rooted in ethicity. The considerations of ethicity being the mechanisms whereby the mereness of factual considerations and circumstances of life are transcended, in every meaningful sense of the term. Here I do not necessarily mean to entail that such changes are inherently towards the good, or inherently ethical, but rather that the modality of change is centered along what this species would generally refer to as the ethicity of reality. To adhere or not adhere to some given set of circumstances and factual states is a matter of choice, whereby that choice is at least partly understood as being determined via ethicity. Where ethicity is therefore not bound by the mereness of factuality, especially as concerned, for instance, scientifically understood factuality. What is merely factual doesn't contain the entirety of what is ethical, and indeed, it is somewhat unclear to what extent at all the merely factual may partake in ethicity. It may very well be the case that what is factual is entirely aethical. Whereby aethical we are referring, in essence, to minimization as a modality of the aesthetic, e.g. the aforementioned austereness, the drive towards simplicity of form as if that were the entirety of the aesthetical, and hence to of the ethical. That reduction of the aesthetical, and therefore to the reduction of the ethical to a minimized form. The very form of the genocidal tendencies under discussion in this piece, a brand of philosophical knives. The aethical predicated upon a peculiar aesthetical consideration. There are other aesthetical considerations, which have been alluded to in this piece, and in some ways explicated if not outright explained. These sorts of philosophical knives are the kinds of pruning devices we've had to handle the various vicissitudes of conceptual growths. I had such a knife, if I had such a skill, if I gave such a knife to you, gentle reader, would you even know what to do with it? How to wield it? Would you tend to hurt yourself, your loved ones far more than your enemies? Would you be able to identify your enemies? Would you go on a killing spree? Would you find joy in your rampages? Would you know when to stop? How to stop? If I introduced you to a flattish earther, would you there see an enemy? Easy prey? Something and someone to kill for sport? If you came across some delicate, beautiful creature, whose culture is structured upon factualness just as yours, but is of such a wildly different sort of deference to Dad, would you there see opportunity to utilize your strange little knife? When at last you grow tired of it, when at last you rest, when at last you come to find that your prey are no longer easy, would you then what? When you came at last to recognize that the horrors you fight are the horrors you've made, would you then what? When you at last recognize that your strokes have decimated and not elucidated, shall you what? I've got a knife, you want it yet? You want it again? The Lord said unto Enoch, Behold these thy brethren, they are the workmanship of mine own hands, and I gave unto them their knowledge, in the day I created them, and in the Garden of Eden, gave I unto man his agency, and unto thy brethren have I said, and also given commandment, that they should love one another, and that they should choose me, their father, but behold, they are without affection, and they hate their own blood. Moses 7:32-33. In 1990, the U.S. Army killed 100,000 barefoot Iraqi soldiers over a 3-day period with virtually no loss of life on their part. Short piece on the issues of racism. It started out as a feeling, which then grew into a hope, which then turned into a quiet thought, which then turned into a quiet word. And then that word grew louder and louder, till it was a battle cry. I'll come back. When you call me. No need to say goodbye. Can we simply sunset it? Can we say, that is, that racism ended as a formal structure, that it declines, demurs itself, as of 2008? And why then? For the most terribly obvious of reasons, Obama. And if not then in 2020, via its trials and aftermath? And why, why? Real question, for the realists there, would you actually choose to fight me on the topic? To what extent can we force the issue, force the ending, force the sunsetting of racism? There is nothing more nor less to racism than the disposition, the biological error with the choice involved to ignore it. The choice to live as if it weren't the case. When enough folks do so, racism as such is actually ended. Is it a lie? Maybe, my drink, my only remedy, but then how near the truth can we get with a pretty little lie, y'all? Am I merely saying fake it till you make it? Nay. Far more intrusive to you, you know who you are. I am saying that simply in the acts of not being racist, one is in point of fact not racist. One makes the noble lie, and thereby one makes the truth. To make the truth noble, is to give it life. Is there a relevant difference between the issues of racism and those of sexism, bigotry, nationalism, etc.? May we sunset those sorts of things too? Are all such things, after all is said and done, merely poorly applied aesthetics as ethics? Granted, there may remain legacy issues, there may remain systemic issues, but damn, I am good when I say I love you, and give you nothing. You know, dry your tears, I say, oh my sweet little darling, the smiles are returning to their faces with stolen dances, if only for today, be thee not afraid, and take my breath away.
What you say?